The weight of a badge. The sun blazed down on the streets of Washington, D.C., sending waves of shimmering heat rippling off the asphalt. It was one of those days where the air itself felt heavy, pressing down on everything and everyone with an invisible weight. In a sleek black SUV, tinted windows shielding her from the harsh afternoon glare, Dr. Evelyn Carter, one of the nation's top civil rights attorneys and a former federal judge, drove toward a speaking engagement at Howard University. She was dressed sharply, her tailored navy blue blazer draped over a crisp white blouse. Her natural curls framed a face that radiated confidence and authority, an authority that she had earned through decades of hard work, fighting in courtrooms where her voice had the power to change laws. Today's talk was on the responsibility of power in law enforcement, a topic that had become more personal to her than she ever wanted. The hum of the city was a familiar soundtrack as she drove, passing through neighborhoods where she had once walked as a young law student, where her passion for justice had been ignited. This city had shaped her, and now she shaped it in return. Just as she approached an intersection, the flash of red and blue lights flooded her rearview mirror. Her eyebrows furrowed. She hadn't been speeding. She knew every traffic law like the back of her hand and had violated none of them. She checked her mirrors, expecting to see the officer speed past toward an emergency, but the cruiser stayed behind her. It was her they wanted. Evelyn sighed, signaling to pull over to the curb. She had dealt with police before, on both sides of the courtroom. She knew the law, she knew her rights, and she knew that whatever this was, she had done nothing wrong. The SUV came to a smooth stop. She turned off the engine, placed her hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Let's see what this is about. The approach. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, his polished boots hitting the pavement with the kind of weight that announced authority. Officer Samuel Hayes was young, mid-30s at most, built like a linebacker, with a posture that suggested he was used to people fearing him. Evelyn had seen his type before. He adjusted his mirrored sunglasses and made his way to the driver's side, moving with slow, deliberate steps. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, not gripping it, but hovering near it, as if he wanted to remind her that it was there. Evelyn rolled down the window before he even reached the car. "Afternoon, officer. What's the issue?" she asked in a polite but firm tone. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if sizing her up, before saying, "License and registration." No greeting, no explanation. Her fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. This wasn't standard procedure. Normally, officers at least provided a reason for pulling someone over: speeding, broken taillight, expired tags. But this one had gone straight to demands. She nodded calmly. "Of course, officer, but may I first ask why I'm being stopped?" His jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. No reason given. No explanation. Not even the usual rehearsed excuse. She'd spent years dissecting cases like these, stories where stops escalated into wrongful arrests, or worse. Her instinct screamed at her that this wasn't right. This was about control. Her voice remained measured. "Officer, I am more than willing to comply, but I need to understand why I am being asked to step out of my vehicle." His hand shifted on his belt. Just a small movement, but she caught it. A flicker of impatience, a glimmer of hostility. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." His tone sharpened. Evelyn inhaled slowly. It was happening. Escalation. She had a choice to make. She could push back harder, demand a supervisor, refuse to exit. She had every right to. But she also knew how these situations could spiral. She had seen it too many times before. Evelyn kept her movements slow, deliberate. "I am reaching for my credentials in my purse," she informed him before moving her hand. As soon as she reached for her bag, his gun was drawn. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, stepping back and pointing the weapon directly at her. A split second of silence. Then the world exploded in noise. A few pedestrians gasped. A car passing by slowed to a crawl, the driver staring wide-eyed at the unfolding scene. Someone on the sidewalk had already pulled out their phone, recording. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears, but her training took over. She stayed still. Any sudden movement, any shift, and this could turn into a statistic. She locked eyes with him. "Officer, my credentials are in my purse. I am reaching for my ID, as requested." Her voice was calm, controlled. He didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he pressed the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, I have a suspect refusing orders. Possible concealed weapon. Requesting backup." Suspect. Her stomach tightened. She had been a federal judge, a top civil rights attorney, a woman who had spent her entire life ensuring justice. And now, in this moment, none of it mattered. He didn't see her title. He didn't see her decades of service. He saw only what he wanted to see. Evelyn exhaled, slow and controlled. "Officer, I am the former U.S. District Judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. I currently serve as the chair of the Civil Rights Oversight Committee. My credentials are inside my bag. I am lawfully carrying a firearm, as per federal authorization." She let the words settle. The pedestrians around them stirred. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others whispered. The person recording stepped a little closer, capturing every second. For a fraction of a moment, hesitation flickered across Hayes's face. But pride was a powerful thing. He wasn't backing down. He had doubled down too hard. And now, the situation was spiraling. The standoff. More sirens screamed in the distance. Evelyn knew exactly what was coming. More officers, more guns, more danger. She kept her hands visible, her breath steady, but inside, anger burned beneath her calm exterior. Not because she was afraid, not because she didn't know what to do, but because she did. And yet, despite all her knowledge, all her experience, she was still here, on the side of a scorching hot street, being treated like a criminal in broad daylight. The only question now was, how much further would this go? And who would stop it? A badge without accountability. The weight of Officer Hayes' gun, steady and unwavering, was aimed at Dr. Evelyn Carter's chest. The sun glared off the polished metal, a cruel reflection of the situation unfolding in the middle of the street. Evelyn didn't move. The muscles in her jaw clenched, but she kept her hands raised where everyone could see them. The weight of 100 unspoken truths settled over her shoulders. She had defended civil rights, fought for accountability, and dismantled cases of racial profiling and police misconduct for over 2 decades. And yet here she was, held at gunpoint in broad daylight for the crime of existing while black. Her status, her influence, her years on the federal bench, none of it mattered to this man. To him, she was just a suspect. The air was thick with tension. On the sidewalk, a woman in a red headscarf had her phone out, recording every second. A few bystanders whispered among themselves. Some held their breath. Others stood frozen, unwilling to get involved but unable to look away. The sirens in the distance were growing louder. More police were coming. And Evelyn knew that with every second that passed, the situation was becoming more dangerous. She exhaled slowly. Stay calm. Control the narrative. Make them listen. Reinforcements arrive. 2 additional squad cars screeched to a halt behind the first cruiser. 4 more officers jumped out, hands hovering over their weapons as they surveyed the scene. Their faces were a mix of concern and confusion. Evelyn saw the moment one of them recognized her. Sergeant David Ruiz. His eyes flickered from her to Officer Hayes, his brow furrowing deeply. "What the hell is going on here?" Ruiz demanded, stepping forward. Hayes didn't lower his weapon. His grip tightened. He was too far in now. He had made his choice, and his pride wouldn't let him back down. Evelyn took a slow breath, keeping her tone measured. "Sergeant Ruiz, I advise you to de-escalate immediately. I am unarmed, and your officer is making a serious mistake." Hayes' face twisted in frustration. She reached for something in her bag. Could be a weapon. Evelyn resisted the urge to scoff. He knew. If she had been any other person, someone without power or influence, someone without the ability to fight back legally, she would have already been thrown to the ground, cuffed, and brutalized. Ruiz's eyes darted back to Evelyn. His mouth tightened. "Lower your weapon, Hayes." Hayes didn't move. Ruiz took another step forward. "Now, officer." The weight of command was clear in his voice. A few of the other officers exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably. They could feel it too. The tides were changing. The crowd was getting bigger. The camera phones were multiplying. This was about to be a PR disaster. Evelyn let silence stretch between them. Then, slowly, Hayes lowered his weapon. The relief in the crowd was palpable. A few murmurs of disbelief rippled through the gathering onlookers. Evelyn, however, knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The ego that wouldn't bend. The moment Hayes holstered his gun, he reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." The order cut through the air like a blade. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You're still going through with this?" Hayes' nostrils flared. His ego was bruised, and he wanted control back. She saw it in his stance, the way his hands twitched at his sides. The moment he had drawn his weapon on her, he had lost the high ground. And now he was trying to shift the blame back onto her. Sergeant Ruiz looked stunned. "Hayes, are you serious?" She refused to comply, and Ruiz held up a hand, cutting him off. "That's enough." His voice was iron. "I know exactly who she is. Do you?" Hayes faltered. Ruiz turned toward Evelyn, his voice dropping to something more respectful. "Dr. Carter, I sincerely apologize. This officer clearly did not follow protocol. If you would like to file a formal complaint." Evelyn took a step forward, her eyes locking onto Hayes with an intensity that made him flinch. She had spent years cross-examining powerful men who thought they were above the law. She had reduced corrupt CEOs to nervous wrecks on the stand. And right now, Hayes was realizing, too late, that he had just made the worst mistake of his career. "I want your badge number, Officer Hayes," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Hayes hesitated. Ruiz didn't. "Give it to her. Now." Reluctantly, Hayes mumbled his badge number under his breath. Evelyn committed it to memory. Sergeant Ruiz turned to his officers. "Turn off your body cams for a moment." The others hesitated. "Sergeant, that's against protocol." "Do it." The body cams went dark. Ruiz stepped closer to Hayes, lowering his voice so that only Evelyn, Hayes, and the other officers could hear. "You do realize who you just pulled a gun on, right?" Hayes clenched his jaw. Ruiz didn't wait for an answer. Dr. Evelyn Carter was a federal judge for 7 years. She has argued cases before the Supreme Court. She is one of the leading voices on police reform and civil rights in this country. Ruiz let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "And you just tried to arrest her." The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes swallowed hard. Ruiz turned back to Evelyn. "Dr. Carter, I will personally ensure that a full investigation is launched into this officer's conduct." Evelyn crossed her arms. "That's not enough." Hayes' face paled. "I want to speak with the chief of police. Today. Right now." Ruiz nodded immediately. "I'll make the call." Hayes shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching as though he wanted to say something. But he didn't. He knew he had lost. And the best part, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fallout begins. Less than an hour later, Evelyn was sitting across from Chief Anthony Reynolds at the Washington, D.C. Police Headquarters. Ruiz had driven her there himself. Across the desk, Chief Reynolds looked visibly uneasy. He was an older man, his graying hair cropped short, his sharp eyes scanning her with measured calculation. "Dr. Carter, let me start by saying how deeply sorry I am for this entire situation." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "Apologies don't mean much without action, Chief." Reynolds exhaled. I understand. Officer Hayes has been suspended pending an investigation. If found guilty of misconduct, he will be terminated. She studied him carefully. And criminal charges. Reynolds hesitated. Evelyn didn't blink. If I had reached for my weapon instead of my ID, you and I both know I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be a headline, a statistic, a funeral. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. I want him charged with unlawful detainment, reckless endangerment, and abuse of power. Silence. Then, finally, Reynolds nodded. I'll speak with the DA. She wasn't satisfied, but it was a start. Evelyn stood. I expect a public statement by the end of the day. If I don't see one, I'll hold my own press conference. Reynolds exhaled sharply. You don't hold back, do you? No, she said simply. Neither should justice. As she walked out of the station, she pulled out her phone. Her Twitter feed was already flooded with videos of the incident. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a movement. And Hayes wasn't the only one who was going to be held accountable. When the nation takes notice, Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped out of the Washington, D.C. police headquarters, the city humming around her like an electric storm on the verge of breaking. The midday sun had climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, but Evelyn barely felt the heat anymore. She had been in battles before, courtroom wars that lasted for months, even years. But this wasn't just about one corrupt officer. This was about an entire system that had let it happen. And the world was watching. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Again, and again, and again. She pulled it out and wasn't surprised. Her Twitter feed was exploding. Hashtag Justice for Carter. Hashtag Policy Reform Now. Hashtag Hold Him Accountable. The video of her stop had already gone viral. The footage captured by a bystander's phone had racked up over 4.2 million views in just 2 hours. People were dissecting every frame, every order Hayes had given, every mistake he had made, every moment where his ego had merely cost an innocent woman her life. Then came the bodycam footage, leaked. Someone inside the department had uploaded the raw, uncut video to the internet. The audio was crystal clear. Do not engage. Stand down immediately. Step out of the car now. I said, hands on the vehicle. You are violating federal protocol. Get these cuffs off her, now. The dam had burst open. Lawyers, politicians, celebrities, activists. Everyone had something to say. The nation wasn't just angry. It was furious. Evelyn tightened her grip around her phone and inhaled deeply. They want to fight, she murmured. They're about to get one. The fallout begins. The Washington Metropolitan Police Department was in full damage control mode. Chief Anthony Reynolds had promised a public statement before the end of the day. Evelyn hadn't even finished her drive home when her phone screen lit up with a notification. Breaking news. D.C. Police Chief announces Officer Samuel Hayes has been placed on administrative leave amidst growing public outcry. Evelyn snorted. Administrative leave. She had spent years battling systemic failures. She knew what administrative leave really meant. Paid vacation. Meanwhile, people like Officer Hayes walked free while others, people without connections, without voices loud enough to shake the system, sat in jail cells for crimes they didn't even commit. Her blood simmered with quiet rage. She wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug. Not this time. The press conference. By 4:00 p.m., every major news outlet had gathered outside the police headquarters. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, local reporters, journalists from independent outlets, social media influencers with millions of followers. Evelyn watched from a private conference room inside as Chief Reynolds stepped up to the podium, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. The cameras flashed. The murmurs hushed. Then he began to speak. Earlier today, an incident occurred involving one of our officers and a civilian who was wrongly detained. While we are still in the process of reviewing all footage and reports, we acknowledge that certain mistakes were made, and we are committed to transparency in this investigation. Mistakes. A mistake is ordering the wrong coffee. A mistake is missing an appointment, pointing a gun at an innocent woman's chest and ignoring every legal protocol. That's not a mistake. That's abuse of power. Evelyn's fingers tapped against the conference table as she listened. Officer Samuel Hayes has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department has also launched an internal review of training protocols to ensure that officers are properly trained in de-escalation tactics and recognizing credentials of high-ranking officials. There it was. The corporate spin. The PR Band-Aid. Evelyn's phone vibrated again. This time, a message from her legal team. "We're ready when you are." She exhaled, set her phone down, and stood up. Time to take control of the story. Taking the fight to court. By the time the press had finished chewing up Reynolds' weak apology, Evelyn was already preparing her next move. Her legal team, some of the sharpest civil rights attorneys in the country, had assembled in her private office, their faces serious. The moment she walked in, Attorney Malik Shah, one of her oldest friends and closest allies, leaned forward. "We have grounds for federal charges, Evelyn." His voice was tight with barely contained anger. "Unlawful detainment, reckless endangerment, falsification of a police report, abuse of authority. The whole damn thing is laid out in their own footage." Another lawyer, Jessica Martin, nodded. "We can move fast. If we file before the police union gets too involved, we can force the DOJ's hand." Evelyn sat down at the head of the table and folded her hands. "What's the likelihood of getting Hayes off the force permanently?" Shaw scoffed. "High. That video alone is career-ending. But termination isn't enough." Evelyn's gaze darkened. "I want him charged. And I want to know how many other officers have complaints against them in this department. If they're protecting one, they're protecting more." Jessica slid a thick folder toward her. "We pulled some records. Officer Hayes has had 6 prior complaints filed against him for excessive force and racial profiling. All of them were either dismissed or handled internally." Evelyn's stomach turned. Of course, he had done this before. And the system had let him. This wasn't just about Hayes. It was about every officer like him, shielded by a broken system that refused to hold them accountable. Evelyn reached for a pen and flipped open the case file. "Then we're not just going after him. We're going after the entire damn system that allowed him to get away with it for this long." Her team nodded in silent agreement. This was war. The nationwide uprising. Within 24 hours, the protests had begun. Across Washington, people took to the streets, marching with signs, chanting Evelyn's name, demanding justice. By the next day, protests had spread to New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles. #Justice for Carter was trending worldwide. Congressional leaders were speaking out. Civil rights groups were mobilizing. Even celebrities were getting involved, some donating to legal funds, others making public statements condemning the department. By the end of the week, the Department of Justice had no choice but to launch a formal investigation into the Washington Metropolitan Police Department and Officer Samuel Hayes. He had gone into hiding. Reporters swarmed his home, demanding answers. But the truth was, there were no answers that could justify what he had done. His career was over. But Evelyn wasn't done. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been falsely profiled. Every person who had been silenced by the system. Every person who had been brutalized and never got justice. She was going to make sure this case didn't just fade away. She was going to change the system itself. And this was only the beginning. The system that protects its own. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Every seat in the grand courtroom was filled. Lawyers, reporters, activists, police union representatives. The walls of the chamber, lined with dark wood and history, seemed to absorb the murmurs of those gathered, as though the very foundation of justice itself was listening. At the center of it all sat Dr. Evelyn Carter. She had spent years in courtrooms like this one, but never as a plaintiff. Today, she wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a judge. She was a woman demanding justice, and the entire country was watching. The defense tries to flip the narrative. Officer Samuel Hayes sat stiffly at the defense table, wearing a crisp, dark blue suit that looked like it had been picked out by his attorney. The once confident arrogance was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Evelyn could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers twitched. He wasn't sorry. He was scared. But fear alone wouldn't be enough to hold him accountable. The defense lawyer, Alan Kingsley, adjusted his tie and stepped forward. A known bulldog in the legal community, Kingsley had defended countless officers accused of misconduct and gotten most of them off. His opening statement was exactly what Evelyn expected. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about injustice. It is about a simple misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. Officer Hayes acted in accordance with his training. He followed protocol. He perceived a threat and responded accordingly. To punish him for doing his job would set a dangerous precedent, one that would leave every officer in America afraid to act when faced with a potential danger on the streets. Evelyn didn't blink. They were going to play this angle. The "he feared for his life" excuse. She had seen it used too many times before. They were going to try to paint her as aggressive. They were going to justify his actions by implying that she had been non-compliant. They would twist reality. They would frame it as just an unfortunate situation. They would argue that Hayes had made an honest mistake, not a crime. But Evelyn had something they didn't: evidence. The prosecution brings the firepower. Evelyn's legal team, led by attorney Malik Shaw, took the floor. He was a force to be reckoned with, sharp-eyed, methodical, and ruthless when necessary. He had dismantled police misconduct cases before. He would do it again. The defense claims this was a misunderstanding, Shaw said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. But let's look at the facts. The first piece of evidence: the police radio logs. Shaw played a recording from the morning of the incident. The courtroom speakers crackled with the sound of dispatch's voice. Unit 12, do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Suspect is not resisting. Then came Hayes' voice, tense and rushed. She's refusing orders. Possible weapon. Requesting backup. The audio shook the courtroom. Even some of the officers in attendance shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hayes had lied. He had ignored direct orders from his own department. The next piece of evidence: the body cam footage. The prosecution played 3 separate angles: Hayes' own camera, another officer's cam from across the street, and the bystander's viral video. The jury watched Hayes' face on the footage, watched as Evelyn calmly told him who she was, watched as he ignored her credentials, watched as he reached for his weapon anyway, watched as he nearly ended her life. The tension in the room thickened. Then Shaw delivered the final blow. Officer Hayes had 6 prior complaints for excessive force. Why were they ignored? He handed a thick folder to the judge. Inside, a paper trail of cover-ups, internal investigations that had been buried, witnesses whose complaints had disappeared, supervisors who had looked the other way. This wasn't just about Hayes. This was about the system that had protected him. The room fell into stunned silence. The jury's eyes widened, and Hayes finally broke. Hayes' breaking point. The defense had no way to refute the footage, no way to twist the audio logs. But Kingsley tried anyway. Officer Hayes had only seconds to react, Kingsley argued. Would any of us have done differently in his position? It was a weak argument, and Hayes knew it, because for the first time since the trial began, he spoke up. I didn't know who she was. Hayes blurted out, his voice hoarse. A hush fell over the room. Evelyn's hands tightened into fists under the table. because she knew what was coming next. I thought she was reaching for a weapon. There it was. The coward's defense. Not, I made a mistake. Not, I was wrong. Not, I escalated the situation when I didn't have to. Just the same tired justification that had excused officers for decades. Hayes' hands trembled as he spoke, but his words weren't an admission of guilt. They were an excuse. Evelyn leaned forward. You thought I was dangerous, because I reached into my bag for my ID. Yet when you pulled your gun on me, I didn't react the way you expected. Why do you think that is, Officer Hayes? Hayes looked away. Because he knew. She wasn't afraid. She had seen this before. She had been preparing for men like him her entire life. The verdict. It took the jury less than 4 hours to deliberate. The courtroom was packed as the foreman stood to deliver the decision. On the charge of unlawful detainment, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. On the charge of falsifying a police report, guilty. Hayes went pale. The defense sagged in their chairs, and Evelyn. She let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. The sentencing would come later, but the message was already clear. He wasn't walking away from this. Not this time. The fallout. The case didn't just end with Hayes' conviction. It triggered something bigger. A federal probe was launched into the entire Washington Metropolitan Police Department. A dozen officers were placed under investigation. Multiple supervisors resigned. Internal affairs was overhauled. And the biggest change. Congressional leaders began pushing for new national reforms on police accountability. Evelyn watched it all unfold with quiet determination. The fight wasn't over. There were still thousands of Hayes out there. Still people suffering without cameras to capture their truth. Still a system that needed to be broken and rebuilt. But today, they had won a battle. And tomorrow, they'd win the war. Beyond the verdict, a nation on the brink. The weight of the verdict settled over Washington, D.C., like a slow-burning storm. The echoes of guilty still reverberated in the halls of the U.S. District Court, but Evelyn Carter knew better than to mistake this for the end. A guilty verdict wasn't justice. It was an exception. And exceptions never fixed the system. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the reality of what she had set in motion hit her all at once. Thousands of protesters had gathered beyond the barricades, chanting her name, waving signs, demanding more than one officer's downfall. No more Hayes. Justice for all, not just the powerful. Reform now. The roar of the crowd was deafening. The air was electric. The world had been watching, and it wasn't about to look away. Evelyn squared her shoulders, exhaled deeply, and walked down the courthouse steps into the fire of history. The police union strikes back. The police union wasn't going to take this lying down. Within hours of the verdict, they issued a statement condemning the trial as a media-driven witch hunt and vowing to fight back. Officer Hayes was sacrificed to appease the outrage mob, their spokesman declared on national television. This verdict sets a dangerous precedent. If officers are too afraid to act, our streets will become lawless. Our officers will hesitate when lives are on the line. This is an attack on law enforcement as a whole. Evelyn had been waiting for them to play this card. She knew exactly how they would spin this. They wouldn't acknowledge Hayes' actions. They wouldn't talk about the 6 prior complaints against him. They wouldn't address the fact that he ignored orders and escalated the situation. Instead, they would make him the victim. They would make her the villain. And she knew how dangerous that could be. Because if they won the narrative war, the next Hayes would walk free. The death threats begin. Evelyn's inbox was flooded. Emails, voicemails, DMs on social media. Some were messages of support. Others were not. I hope you rot in hell for what you did to that officer. You're destroying this country. Watch your back. Her security detail increased overnight. The FBI even stepped in, investigating some of the more serious threats. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She had spent her life standing in the fire. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to scare her into silence. And it wouldn't be the last. The national conversation shifts. The case was no longer just about Hayes. It had opened a floodgate. Other victims of police misconduct began stepping forward. More cases, more stories. A black veteran wrongfully detained by police in Chicago. A pregnant woman in Atlanta pulled over at gunpoint for a traffic violation. A teenager in New York who was slammed to the pavement and cuffed for fitting the description. Their stories had been ignored before. But now, people were listening. News outlets dug into police departments across the country. Reports surfaced of hidden misconduct cases, buried complaints, cover-ups. Even officers within law enforcement started speaking out. Some retired cops admitted they had seen cases like Evelyn's dozens of times, but without a high-profile victim, nothing was ever done. The nation was at a boiling point. The question was, would it lead to real change? Or would the system bury this moment like it always had? The fight for legislation. Evelyn knew that one conviction wasn't enough. If they didn't turn this moment into law, it would all be for nothing. So she went straight to Congress. With a team of legal experts and civil rights leaders, she drafted the National Police Accountability Act, a bill designed to create an independent federal review board for police misconduct cases, limit qualified immunity for officers who abuse their power, make body cam tampering or deactivation a felony, require federal oversight of local police departments with repeated complaints, and the most controversial part, create a public, nationwide database of officers with misconduct records, so they couldn't simply transfer to another department and repeat the cycle. The moment the bill was announced, the backlash was instant. Politicians on both sides of the aisle either championed it or attacked it. Law enforcement agencies fought tooth and nail to block it. Debates raged on cable news. And Evelyn? She relentlessly pushed forward. She went on talk shows, interviews, town halls. She debated union leaders, senators, governors. She made it clear. This wasn't just about her. This was about stopping the next Hayes before they had a chance to ruin another life. And the people listened. Petitions were signed. Protests grew. Public pressure mounted, until Congress had no choice but to bring the bill to the floor. The vote that changed everything. The day of the vote, Washington, D.C. was in chaos. Thousands of protesters stood outside the Capitol building, waiting for history to be made. Inside, politicians fought bitterly. The bill barely passed the House. Then came the Senate showdown, and in a stunning, nail-biting 52-48 vote, the National Police Accountability Act became law. The chambers erupted. The crowd outside exploded with cheers. And Evelyn, she sat quietly, hands clasped, as tears filled her eyes. They did it. Not just for her, but for everyone who never got justice, for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who thought the system would never change. The legacy of a battle won. Months later, Evelyn stood before a packed auditorium at Howard University. She had been invited to give a lecture, not on law, not on policy, but on change. She looked out at the young faces staring back at her, future lawyers, activists, politicians, and she spoke the truth. Change is never given. It is fought for. It is bled for. It is demanded. And when the system tells you no, you fight until the only answer left is yes. The audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the hall. Somewhere in the crowd, a young woman wiped tears from her eyes. A young man nodded with fierce determination. They weren't just listening. They were preparing. Because the fight wasn't over. It never was. But thanks to this battle, the next fight would be a little easier. And the system, it would never be the same again. The battle never ends, but neither does the fight. The streets of Washington, D.C. were quieter now, but the echoes of change still vibrated in the air. The protests had faded, the headlines had shifted, but the impact of Evelyn Carter's case and the National Police Accountability Act had left an indelible mark on the nation. Some called it a victory for justice. Others called it a dangerous shift that threatened law enforcement. Evelyn. She knew the truth. Laws could change, but culture took longer. And the fight was far from over. The pushback. When power refuses to let go. The ink hadn't even dried on the National Police Accountability Act before law enforcement unions and their allies launched a full-scale resistance. Police chiefs from across the country held press conferences denouncing the law. This is a direct attack on the brave men and women who put their lives on the line every day. The Carter Act, if I may call it that, is nothing more than a political stunt that makes our streets more dangerous. How can we protect people if we're forced to hesitate before acting? Some cities outright refused to implement the reforms. States filed lawsuits against the federal government, claiming the law was unconstitutional overreach. One governor even signed an executive order banning the use of the new National Police Misconduct Database in their state, calling it an unfair blacklist that punishes officers for doing their jobs. Evelyn expected this. She had spent her entire career fighting entrenched power structures. They would dig their heels in. They would stall progress. They would resist change with every weapon at their disposal. But she had one advantage they didn't: the people. A movement that refused to die. While politicians and police unions fought to gut the reforms, the public refused to let the issue die. Protesters continued demonstrating in cities across the country. Activists filed lawsuits against departments that refused to comply. Investigative journalists dug deeper into police misconduct cover-ups, exposing corruption at every level. Most importantly, communities that had once been powerless were now fighting back. For decades, people had been afraid to report officers who abused their power. They believed the system would protect the guilty and punish the innocent. But now, people were filing complaints. Now misconduct was being documented. Now, officers who once felt untouchable were being held accountable. In just 6 months, over 200 officers across the country had been fired or indicted for past misconduct that had gone unchecked. Departments that refused to comply with the new oversight laws lost federal funding. And the biggest wake-up call. For the first time in history, an entire police department was shut down and rebuilt from the ground up. The city of Oakland, California, after years of corruption, was forced to disband its police force and replace it with a fully restructured department under new leadership and strict federal oversight. It was a turning point, and it was just the beginning. The backlash against Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had become a symbol. For many, she was a hero. For others, she was a villain. The death threats never stopped. Her home address was leaked online. Right-wing commentators attacked her on national television. She was called a traitor, a radical, a disgrace. Some claim she had set police officers up to fail. Others accuse her of playing the race card. A congressman from Texas even suggested that she hated law enforcement and wanted to defund the police. Evelyn's response: holding law enforcement accountable is not an attack on police. It's an attack on corruption. And if that offends you, then maybe you're part of the problem. She didn't back down. But the stress was real. Her security detail was tripled. Her movements were monitored constantly. She could no longer do simple things like go out for coffee without being followed by either supporters or critics. She had become a political target. And one night, after a long day of meetings, her closest friend and legal advisor, Malik Shah, pulled her aside. "How long can you keep this up, Evie?" he asked, concern etched into his face. "You're fighting the whole damn system, and the system fights back." She looked at him, tired, worn, but unshaken. "As long as it takes," she said. And she meant it. 5 years later, a changed nation. The anniversary of the verdict had arrived. 5 years since Officer Hayes had been convicted. 5 years since the National Police Accountability Act had passed. 5 years since Evelyn had become a household name. Much had changed. Police departments across the country were now required to undergo mandatory federal reviews every 5 years. Over 3,000 officers had been removed from duty after being found guilty of misconduct. Body cam footage was now automatically uploaded to a federal database, untamperable, unalterable. The nationwide police misconduct registry had prevented over 8,000 fired officers from being quietly rehired by other departments. But change wasn't universal. Some states still fought the law. Some cities still resisted reform. The fight wasn't over. But Evelyn had never expected a perfect victory. Only progress. And on the night of the anniversary, as she sat in her office, she received a message that reminded her why she had started this fight in the first place. It was from a young black woman in Ohio. A woman who had once been wrongfully arrested and brutalized by police. A woman who had once felt hopeless. Her message was simple. I just wanted you to know. I reported my case. And this time, someone actually listened. Thank you. Evelyn closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile. One battle won, 1,000 more to go. But for tonight, she would let herself rest, because the war wasn't over. It never would be. But thanks to her fight, it would never be the same again. Continuation and conclusion. The fire that never dies. The 5-year anniversary of Officer Samuel Hayes' conviction had passed, but the scars it left on the nation were still visible. The streets of America still carried the weight of Evelyn Carter's fight. Some celebrated her, others despised her. But one thing was certain, she had changed history. Evelyn sat in her office in New York, overlooking the city skyline. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside her as she flipped through another case file. A new police brutality case out of Louisiana. The fight never ended. It had only evolved. Her legal team had grown from a handful of passionate civil rights attorneys into a nationwide legal force, taking on cases from communities that had never had a voice. The Carter Foundation for Justice had become the largest independent legal advocacy group in America, offering free legal support to victims of police misconduct. But Evelyn knew, real change wasn't just in the courts. It was in the law. It was in the hearts and minds of people. And the biggest battle was yet to come. The election that could change everything. A new presidential election was approaching, and the stakes had never been higher. One candidate fully supported the Carter Act and wanted to expand it further, closing more loopholes, increasing civilian oversight of law enforcement. The other candidate, a hardline law and order politician who had promised to repeal every part of the act, calling it anti-police and a disgrace to America's law enforcement. For the first time in her career, Evelyn was being called upon to do something she had never considered: run for office. Her name had been floated in progressive political circles for years, but she had always refused. I'm a lawyer, not a politician. But now she wasn't sure she had a choice. The crossroads of destiny. One evening, as Evelyn sat in her home, surrounded by legal papers, policy drafts, and books on constitutional law, her closest friend and legal advisor, Malik Shaw, placed a sealed envelope in front of her. She raised an eyebrow. What's this? Malik leaned back. A petition, signed by over 100,000 people, asking you to run for the Senate. Evelyn froze. She had expected this. But expecting something and facing it head-on were two different things. Malik continued, "You're already the most powerful civil rights attorney in the country. But if you really want to change the system, you need to be inside it." Evelyn looked down at the petition. The signatures felt heavy. People believed in her. They believed she could be more than just a lawyer fighting cases. They believed she could rewrite the law itself. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. For years, she had fought from the outside, filing lawsuits, pushing for reform, challenging corrupt police forces one case at a time. But was it enough? Was it time to step into the fire? A decision that would shape the future. Evelyn spent the next 2 weeks in deep reflection. She walked the streets of D.C., listening to people talk about their fears, their hopes. She visited the memorials of those who never got justice, the faces of innocent people taken too soon by a broken system. She sat alone in her childhood church, thinking about her parents, the people who had taught her what it meant to stand for something bigger than herself. And then one night, as she stood on the balcony of her apartment, staring at the city she had fought so hard for, she made her decision. She turned to Malik and said only 2 words. "Let's go." The announcement that shook the nation. The next morning, Evelyn stood before a crowd of thousands in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Cameras from every major news network were trained on her. The world was holding its breath. She adjusted the microphone, cleared her throat, and then, with fire in her eyes, she spoke. "5 years ago, I stood in a courtroom and watched as justice was finally served, for me. But what about the people who will never see a courtroom? What about the voices that never get heard?" The crowd roared. She took a breath, steady, powerful. "The truth is, the system doesn't change unless we change it. And for too long, we've been told to wait, to be patient, to accept what we're given." She shook her head. "I refuse." Applause thundered across the National Mall. Evelyn's voice never wavered. "And that's why today, I am officially announcing my candidacy for the United States Senate." The crowd erupted. Somewhere in the back, Malik grinned, because he knew what was coming next. This wasn't just about a campaign. This was about a revolution. The final battle, changing the system from within. As Evelyn launched her campaign, the world watched. Some called her a visionary. Others called her a threat. The police unions poured millions of dollars into attack ads against her. But the people rallied. They funded her campaign in record numbers. They packed town halls to hear her speak. They registered to vote in droves. Because they knew what was at stake. If Evelyn won, she wouldn't just be a senator. She would be a symbol that the system could be changed, not just through protests, not just through lawsuits, but by taking power away from those who abused it. The campaign trail was brutal. The death threats increased. The attacks got nastier. But Evelyn never stopped, because she knew. This wasn't just about her. This was about the next generation, about the people who would come after her, the ones who would carry the fight forward. And so, on election night, as the final votes were counted, Evelyn stood in front of the nation and waited. The news anchors called it. The numbers flashed on the screen. And then, we can now project that Dr. Evelyn Carter has won the race for U.S. Senate. The crowd erupted. Tears streamed down faces. History had been made. Again. Epilogue. The fire that never dies. Years later, when Evelyn sat in the Senate chamber, preparing to introduce a bill that would take police reform even further, she thought about that day on the side of the road. The flashing lights. The gun aimed at her chest. The moment that changed everything. And she smiled. Because power had tried to silence her. Instead, it had made her unstoppable. And now, she wasn't just fighting the system. She was the system. And she was just getting started.